have ever held the South was right. The very nomination of Abraham Lincoln 4 years ago spoke plainly of war upon Southern rights and institutions. This man's appearance, his coarse, vulgar, low jokes, and his principles proved the satyr-like character of his mind. He was in the original abolitionist, and like them, held these ideas paramount to any other duty. I vowed to strike.
Last night, our beloved President Abraham Lincoln has been cruelly assassinated. In the wake of our victory, just days after the surrender, in which signaled the end of our long and bloody Civil War, this nation is struck with unfathomable sorrow. Remember his words at Gettysburg, where he declared that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Gettysburg is probably the most important battlefield that Americans take pilgrimages to.
And some archaeological work that was done over the last sort of 20 years or so has uncovered the remains of some of these field hospitals. And I know from talking to the archaeologists that the soil was so compacted and full of blood that it still retained the smell and also retained some of the body parts that had been removed.
And that's one of the places I went to as a young boy, was Battle of Gettysburg. Even more than Yorktown or any other battle in the United States, Gettysburg still holds a central place as a pivotal moment in American history. Well, I mean, I was so young at that time, I don't know if I could talk too much about it. I just remember big.
We're looking at the abolition of slavery. We're looking at the change of approach to the United States, the fact that everybody was free.
But the big way that Gettysburg has affected American history is that it was treated after the battle as a joint American tragedy. Both the North and the South suffered terribly at, and in an ironic way, it becomes almost a unifying factor in that regard because of the shared trauma of the Battle of Gettysburg.
And the capability of therefore creating the modern United States out of the ashes of this Civil War all starts with the Battle of Gettysburg. And if you like, it is Gettysburg that led to the freedom of all in the United States today.
The US Civil War is a defining chapter in American history, with the Battle of Gettysburg greatly shaping its outcome. But to understand the origins of this conflict, where brothers fought side by side, we must look at the role of one man, perhaps the most renowned president in the nation's history.
Right now, Abraham Lincoln is probably the most popular U.S. president, the most famous and popular president that ever lived, but at the time that wasn't the case. And when he was elected, he had something like the support of 55% of the popular vote, which wasn't a huge mandate.
The challenge he had, of course, was that the southern states didn't trust him. They knew that he had his sights set on abolishing slavery, whereas Lincoln, of course, himself, being a lawyer, was pragmatic. He didn't actually set out to abolish slavery from his first inception, but he thought, well, we'll try and ensure that we phase it out, in effect.
Even in the North, when he takes office, his popularity starts to decline. And even when it does resurge again after certain victories in the course of the Civil War, it never gets above like 57%. Throughout much of the period when he was president, he was actually a very unpopular president. And it wasn't until he was assassinated that actually his popularity started to go up to the levels that we see now. So he's kind of like an artist that way. He didn't become popular until he had died.
But the reality is that Lincoln was somebody that was popular, that people did see that he was a man who was true to his principles.
Our nation was founded on the idea of freedom. Yet an uneasy feeling was growing among our people. It was only a matter of time before the tensions would soak our fields with blood.
The critical thing about the United States is that it was held together with these sets of states, the southern states who were slave owners and Union states who were largely industrial.
The big issue that dominated Congress throughout this early part of the century was the issue of slavery and where you would have slavery in the United States.
The critical point here, of course, is the economy of the southern states was primarily agricultural, and they depended upon manpower. And what the southern states therefore wanted to use was a set of slaves in order to do this, cotton, for example, being a principal crop. The problem with this is that it's something that could not be sustained. Most of the European states, most of the world in fact, had got away from slavery as some kind of form of labor, but the southern states wanted to hold on to that.
In the early 19th century, the United States was divided by 11 free states and 11 slave states. This created a balance of power in the Senate. However, this equilibrium was about to be disrupted, which would set the stage for the events that would ultimately lead to the Civil War. In 1821, Missouri sought to join the Union as a slave state. This would threaten to disrupt the balance of power between the free and slave state politicians in the Senate. To resolve this, the senators crafted a compromise. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, while Maine, previously part of Massachusetts, would now join as a free state, maintaining the equilibrium. Preserving the numerical balance in the Senate between free and slave states was essential to both northern and southern political interests. Additionally, the compromise drew an imaginary line across the Louisiana Purchase territory at this parallel, north of which slavery was prohibited in future states, with the exception of Missouri.
There was a compromise admitting Missouri in 1820, which created a practice where every time they admitted a slave state into the Union, they admitted a non-slave state to compensate for that, to balance it out.
This balance was crucial because if one faction gained a majority, it could easily impose its ideals over the other side when voting. So the compromise temporarily eased political tensions. But it was only a short-term solution for a deepening national divide. The balance it aimed to preserve would be repeatedly challenged. As Americans ventured west, new states would begin to join the Union.
That practice starts to fall apart. The Missouri Compromise starts to be seen as illegal by some people in Congress by the time we get to the 1840s and 1850s.
In 1836, Arkansas were next to join the Union. They were admitted as a slave state, which was followed by Michigan in 1837, who joined as a free state. Then it was Texas who joined next as a slave state, followed by Iowa as a free state. The Compromise of 1850 allowed California to enter as a free state, while the territories of Utah and New Mexico were left to decide the issue of slavery through sovereignty. The pattern continued with the admission of Minnesota and Oregon, both as free states in the late 1850s. However, in 1861, Kansas was also admitted as a free state, and the scales of political balance would begin to lean too far to one side, contributing to the increasing tensions that inevitably birthed the U.S. Civil War.
We have a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, a very unfortunate decision, the Dred Scott case, which decides that former slaves or Africans or African slaves do not have any rights to U.S. citizenship. In different words, the gist of this was that black people have no rights which white people are bound to respect. And so this is one of the things that really gets dander up for abolitionists, because this compromise had been in place, which at least prevented slavery from seeping into the new northern states as we moved out to the west, that compromise was a dead letter. And that we have this actually almost going backwards on progress regarding the United States as a whole and dealing with the balance of slavery.
Tensions across the Union had now reached its limit. And with the prospect of Abraham Lincoln to be the new president, the 1860s was about to take a bloody turn.
When Lincoln was elected in 1860, and he was going to take office in March, you still had the previous president in charge, Buchanan, and Buchanan felt that there was no requirement or there was no power given to the president to force the Union to stay together. The main thing was that would be a threat to their state economies, but there was also the issue of that they didn't want the federal government to tell them what to do. So there was also the issue of state rights.
So what happened, of course, is that South Carolina decided it was going to secede, which is a word that is probably uncommon in today's environment. But seceding meant that it would leave the Union, it would leave the United States, and would set up as a state on its own right.
And so first we have South Carolina, and then a number of other states. We have 7 states. By the time we get to February, March, we have 7 states that have seceded.
All of them who were slave-owning states who allowed slavery as part of a unique component of their work. Remembering, of course, that the southern states were largely agricultural, and so they depended upon huge manpower.
11 states that form the Confederacy, then we have 12 states, and then we have Kentucky, which officially stays neutral, but they set up an alternative government that then votes to join the Confederacy. So the number is always a little bit vague on which states were technically part of the Confederacy.
Lincoln wanted to maintain the Union. It was the Union forever. That's how the Union saw themselves, and they couldn't think about this, and therefore fractioning up the United States into 2 major components.
We are doomed to tear apart the fabric of our once united belonging. Lives will be lost, families will be ruined, a war is coming.
So when we look at the American Civil War, we see 2 sides with different perspectives. So you have 2 completely different sets of states.
When these states started to secede, they started to seize control of different federal installations throughout the South. One of the things that actually encouraged Virginia and other states to join the secession was that Lincoln called for an army of volunteers in the North to invade South Carolina and force it back into the Union. And so the idea that the President of the United States would actually organize an army to invade was so anathema to some of these people that they immediately switched sides. Not to say that they wouldn't have been anyway, but later, but that's one of the things that actually urged them to secede.
One of the interesting things about the generals of the Civil War is that most of them knew each other, and many of them had been trained together in West Point, which is the US military academy. And so what we're seeing is that many of these career officers had served in other wars. So there was the Mexican War, for example, in 1848.
In which many of the chief officers in the American Civil War had been veterans of, on both the Confederate and the Federal side. They had all been veterans of this war against Mexico.
Those men had to make a decision as to who they would serve with. Robert E. Lee is a good example of this. He believed strongly that he had to have state first and then Union second. And so it meant that when he was called upon by the United States, he said, no, I'm going to stay with Virginia, and Virginia is where I will be fighting.
General Meade had just taken charge of the Army. He was a much more of a conservative general.
Meade was considered to be a little bit irascible, bad-tempered perhaps, a bit too cautious.
He was also not politically in the same camp as Lincoln. He was one of the supporters of McClellan, who was the guy who ran against Lincoln in the 1864 campaign and was in pursuit of, actually wanted to bring an end to the war, negotiated peace.
Certainly from Lee's perspective, who fought on the Confederate side, to stay with the Virginians, whereas Meade, of course, himself from Pennsylvania, would be fighting in his own backyard in the Union.
One of the things to remember is that the South had a much lower population than the North. Over time, it had fewer people to draw upon, and a great percentage of those people, 4 million, were slaves. The North had a much larger population, had a much larger industrial base, it had a much better railway network. Its logistical framework was much more solid, but it was less prepared than the South when the South mobilized for secession.
Therefore, you have a Union that is very well supplied. Guns, weapons, artillery, uniforms, food, you name it. This could all be supplied through the industrial heartlands of the United States of America. In terms of the South, they had few opportunities to manufacture their own weapons, so they had to import them. A large amount of those imported from the United Kingdom, but also from other parts of Europe.
So in a short-term contest, had they limited this contest to just a couple of years, then perhaps the South would have won. But over the long term, as we saw in World War II, over the long term, the North was already predetermined to win.
In the early stages of the Civil War, we actually start to see the Confederates taking the upper hand. And so the first battle of the Bull Run of Manassas saw the Union routed. This was really within shouting distance almost of Washington, D.C. And this was a major shock to the Union, who think, well, how come they are taking the upper hand? And it really came down to the generalship. So as we see the battles unfolding, we have two major theatres of war. You have a theatre of war which is based in Virginia and in the area sort of south of Washington, D.C. And you also have another area, another theatre of war, which is out in the central part. And so what we're seeing battles that are touching off in those areas with some victories for the Union, for example, Ulysses S. Grant in Fort Donelson, but also we're starting to see major setbacks for the Union in the Virginia theatre of war. And so by the time we get to the run-up towards Gettysburg, the Union has suffered a major defeat at the Battle of Chancellorsville. And that defeat, again, the Union was thinking, well, what is the opportunity for us? How are we going to take charge?
There's different views on how Gettysburg took place, why it took place, where it did, and when it did. One school is that it happened by accident, that the troops were out there and they had to take the positions they did. A revisionist view is actually the positions that they took were the ones that they had to take because of supply concerns with the Confederate Army. They needed certain access to water, they needed this, so they took the positions that they had to take in the area in order to keep their troops in supply and their horses in supply and this kind of thing.
What happened with the Battle of Gettysburg is we see it opening when we have a chance encounter between two forces. General Buford, who was in charge of a cavalry unit, was on the outskirts of Gettysburg to the north.
So he was on the prowl looking to encounter other federal troops somewhere in the countryside when he actually should have been scouting for General Lee.
And what we also see is that Henry Heth, a general on the Confederate side, was starting to move towards Gettysburg in order, again, to look for provisions and supplies for his troops. So as the Confederates are moving into Gettysburg, they're realizing and they're connecting with Buford, and a skirmish commenced. So this was a standoff that saw the battle commence at this location, and it was at this time that Meade realized that this was a chance for him to retreat back to a series of hills that he could defend that would hopefully expend the Confederate armies on that defensive position.
As the day drew to a close, Meade and the Union Army tactically withdrew to the south. Both sides solidified their positions, preparing themselves for the brutal days of fighting that lay ahead.
So one of the things that's really important about Gettysburg is its topography, the terrain, the land.
And so the Federal Army has lined itself on the high points into an inverted fishhook at such an extent so that Lee's forces won't move around the flanks. That's what Longstreet actually wants to move around the Federal flanks, but Lee doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to spread his troops in such a wide extent.
You've heard of the phrase, take the high ground, where the infantry, the armies are sitting on the high ground, and that means the enemy are looking up at them and have to constantly try and attack. From Culp's Hill, closest to Gettysburg, through to a place called Little Round Top. And in between that, we have Cemetery Ridge and a whole range of other locations. This forms a shape of a fishhook.
It was a very good defensive position for Meade to hold off Confederate attacks.
The Confederates have lost the opportunity to have that high ground. There's a valley in front of these hills. So what the Confederates do is that they take up position on another ridge which parallels that fishhook. And from that position, of course, they look over towards the Union troops and realize that they have to somehow take this on.
And so that's one of the big things that's happening on the second day. So they're trying to, the fighting at that time is to take control of the different hills, like Little Round Top.
So they decide on a set of flank attacks. So if you have this ridge with two ends, and then the middle part being the Cemetery Ridge, rather than attacking the front, they decide if they can get round the fishhook, then they can take out those Union troops on either end, and therefore what you might call roll it up. They would actually allow the troops to be squoze between the two and probably seek them to be destroyed or surrender.
The much anticipated battle had now commenced, and the fields of Pennsylvania were to be stained with blood.
One of the famous actions of that day on the 2nd was the attack at Little Round Top.
This is actually one of the most famous episodes of the battle. So you have Chamberlain, who's there with the main troops. They're able to hold it against wave after wave of Confederate attack. At a certain point, they're out of ammunition, and so instead of retreating or withdrawing, they actually take the initiative and make a charge using bayonets, which frightens the Confederates so much, the Confederates start to reel about and retreat.
Which broke the Confederate advance and meant that they could withstand the assault and hold the line. If these flanks had folded, then the center would have been destroyed or at least have been routed by the Confederates. So it was really important that Joshua Chamberlain was able to do this. I mean, he's been given a huge amount of credit for this.
And this becomes a defeat for the Confederates. It maybe shouldn't have been. It's just the initiative that Chamberlain took won the day.
And this saved the day in many ways.
Whilst the Union fiercely defended the flanks, the Confederates just north were relentlessly maintaining pressure along the battlegrounds of Gettysburg's most open theatre of war.
So one of the controversial components of that battle was General Sickles. So he was on the left flank, and he saw in front of him there was a set of high ground that if the the Confederates could have taken it. This could have been a weak spot for the Union. So he decided to move forward into that position, to take his men and to take this particular location. So Sickles created this bulge, this salient, because he wanted to take the high ground, but it meant that there was a weakness in the Union Army. It meant that there were fewer men to hold that particular location. During this action, Sickles himself was hit by a cannonball in his leg. The thing about Sickles was, although he was an irascible kind of a character, he was also a man who was capable of showing to his troops that he was almost, inhuman. He was able to say, look, my leg's been shattered, but here I am puffing on a cigar and grinning at you troops. And I think this was recognized. In 35 years later, he got the Congressional Medal of Honor for his action. So he's a controversial character. If you want to see his leg, it's on display, I believe, in Washington, D.C. in a medical museum. But Sickles is indicative of the fact that generals were not immune from death in this war. There were a lot of generals killed in the Civil War, and Sickles clearly was a brave man. Day one, this chance encounter and the opportunity for George Meade to take up the defensive position. Day two, they attacked on the flanks at Culp's Hill and Little Round Top. The opportunity there for the Confederates to try and roll up the Union troops who were in this defensive position. So what was left to the Confederacy on day three? They decided that they would attack the center.
What's going on in Lee's mind is that when you get to that third day, that he's fought the second day, he's weakened the flanks. The Union has supposedly diverted troops from the center to these flank positions. And so Lee believes that the Union is weak at the center and he's going to make a stride towards the center.
And so what this meant was they had to get a huge number of troops together to try and assault the central position on Cemetery Hill. So quite famously, it was put to General Pickett.
They mobilized Pickett and other units that they can mass together for this march across this 1 mile wide open field.
And then walk upwards or run upwards a slope into the guns of the Union troops. I think anybody who studies military history would know is a chancy maneuver. Would you have the momentum, the opportunity to break through?
Lee encounters a disoriented Pickett after this march of his people, and he really cared about his people, his men, and tells him, well, what are you doing? Your job is to get your division together.
He said, sir, I don't have a division, reflecting on the losses that had already been achieved by the Confederates. Nevertheless, they got 12,000 troops together, and they were able to assault the stone wall in effect. And this meant that as those troops moved forward through the slopes, over the slopes, they were facing these massed guns of the Union.
As the Confederate forces are making this march across the mile of these fields, they launch the barrages of artillery. First, they have the longer distance guns, which launch the explosive shells, which knocks over 10, 11 people at a time. But as they start to get closer, they use the 12-pounder guns to send the cannonballs, or like bowling balls, right through patches of troops. And then as they get ever closer, like at Waterloo in the Middle and Young Guard, they launch the canister shot, which sprays all these pellets and shreds from the canisters in all directions, mortally wounding or otherwise incapacitating a large number of troops as well.
And gradually that momentum died away, and only a relatively few men achieved the opportunity of getting to that wall and assaulting the Union. The
Confederates actually get to the wall. They actually take part of the wall, but they're so spent that they're forced into full retreat. And on the field, they've left 2/3 of the force that has marched dead.
When you think about this, you can imagine those men who were at the bottom of that ridge, Cemetery Ridge, looking up towards the Union lines, realizing that they would have to cross this scrubby field on foot with their rifles and bayonets and face the Union, who were looking down at them with artillery, with their rifles, and the capability of them, therefore, to pick off this charge.
One of the problems of fighting this time is not so much about your individual skill as a warrior that counts, it's your role as part of a larger unit. So once you're actually in a movement, you can't get out individually. You're locked in place. It's kind of like a Greek tragedy on foot. You see your doom ahead of you, but there's no way to extricate yourself from the thing. So many people would likely have felt trapped in their situation on the battlefield.
And so you can imagine, can't you, as these men are committed to moving up this slope, a low slope, but one that goes on, seems to go on forever. I've traversed that particular slope, and it is incredible to imagine crossing this huge field to get to this wall with Union soldiers staring at you with their rifle muskets. The thing about these American Civil War battles is the rifles themselves and the actual weapons that you used were high powered. And so the wounds and wounding of both sides was immense trauma.
You would smell the gun smoke, you'd smell the fear, you'd hear the sounds of people crying in agony, you'd see people who were, you'd see even grown men who were crying because battlefield stress, shock.
Bones would be shattered by these bullets, which were massive. They were traveling at relatively high velocity, and they were being fired at close range.
The bullet had a hollow chamber, and it was smaller than the rifle barrel of the gun. And when it was hit, the hollow part expanded and fit the groove of the rifle bore, so that the rifling sent it spinning and made it much more accurate, allowed it to go much further, much more accurately, with much more power.
As these things penetrated those bodies, you can imagine as they fell forward, they would see their soldiers, their friends, perhaps people from the same villages, seeing the loss of those men as they fell to the left and right of them, walking in really into death. The Confederates and the Union soldiers had got used to this level of warfare, but it must have been slaughter on that battlefield. Large numbers of men dying, wounded, bleeding out. It must have been a really gruesome sight to see. What happens, of course, is that Meade holding the line, holding the flanks and holding the center, it meant that battle was lost. And Lee knew it was lost.
Well, Lee took it very seriously, and his first job was to get his army back to Virginia safely.
He knew that he had to retire from that battlefield in order to retain and keep the remainder of his Confederate soldiers, because there was still a war to win. And so he would leave the battlefield recognizing that he'd lost that battle, and probably recognizing the biggest battle of the Civil War was going to be a major blow to the Confederacy.
And he immediately offered his resignation to Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, who rejected that resignation. Lee would have known that the war was over. He would still fight for 2 more years for Virginia until the surrender, but he would have known that this was his last best chance to win the war.
Can't imagine what it must have felt like for somebody like Lee, who had victories under his belt, to actually suffer this major defeat. And of course, it meant for Meade and also for Lincoln back in Washington, this was a major advantage that they had, the opportunity to take, in effect, the high ground, both in terms of the battleground, but also in terms of the future of this war.
other thing that happened on the very same day was that Vicksburg fell, and Vicksburg was on the Mississippi River. It gave the Union control of Mississippi. So these two blows on the same day were effectively marked the turning point for the Civil War.
This meant that in Vicksburg on the Mississippi, now Grant and the Union were able to control the Mississippi River.
Until that point, it was still possible for the South to win. Not in terms of beating the North per se, not taking over the North or something like that, but in terms of incurring so many defeats on the North that they were bound to surrender. But from Vicksburg and Gettysburg, the tide had turned, and it was definitely going to wind up being a Southern defeat.
If you visit Gettysburg today, it still has a sense of that time. Many of the houses in Gettysburg were present during the battle, so there's a real sense of history there. But one thing that you can't really imagine is what it was like in the aftermath of battle. There were so many men that were wounded, they had to create a series of hospitals, makeshift hospitals in the town itself, in barns, in other locations, so that they could treat the wounded.
You had a mass of wounded on both sides, Confederate wounded who had been left behind and Union wounded who were there. They were carried away from the field by ambulance, and they were brought to different surgical tents and that kind of thing to see if they could be saved or not.
Gettysburg de facto became a town with huge amount of wounded men, of hospitals, and this would continue onwards for at least another year as men who couldn't be moved out of this location in these makeshift hospitals. What also happened, of course, is that there was a new cemetery opened in Gettysburg, and it's at this location that, of course, Lincoln gave his famous Gettysburg Address, and something which would be of dramatic emphasis to all of the Union. This was a significant moment.
But it's very short. It's remembered as a very significant speech, but at the time it was criticized as being very short and not commensurate with the seriousness of the occasion. So he had a lot of criticism for that. But what it marked was a change in the way that Lincoln was presenting the war. Until that point, it had been presented as a war to save the Union. Instead, now he was pitching the war as much more a struggle for a fuller realization of freedom and liberty and democracy. Freedom for everybody, including the freed slaves. So that's what the Gettysburg Address marked more than anything else.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. From these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
So when Lincoln became president, he never lost his sights on the emancipation of slaves, and so in 1863 he announced the Emancipation Proclamation, which would say that henceforth all slaves would be freed.
Which means that as the Union Army moves through, all the slaves they encounter in the states that are rebelling against the United States, they'll be freed, and they will be included in the Union Army. And so we have the large-scale inclusion of freed African slaves who start to join the Union Army, start to swell its numbers.
Now, he was doing this whilst the war was still going on, and the opportunity, of course, for those slaves in the South to be freed was nil at that point. So in 1864, he put before the Senate the idea of the 13th Amendment.
13th Amendment is achieved, which frees slaves. It bans private slavery,
setting into the Constitution that all men would be freed and that slavery would not be an institution that could exist in the United States.
This is hugely disruptive to the Southern economy. It creates the potential for slaves just picking up and running away because they know that the Union will free them. It creates a lot of fear amongst the South.
It took some time for this to be passed, but it was finally passed in 1865, and that, in essence, became one of the major outcomes of the Civil War and of Lincoln's presidency. So starting out with this sort of cautious approach, leading to his belief in 1863 that through the proclamation that all men would be free, and by the end of it, in 1865, of course, that would pass through the Senate and actually become enshrined within the Constitution as the 13th Amendment, and therefore abolishing slavery forever.
The abolishment of slavery profoundly changed the course of American history. But where monumental strides towards justice are achieved, they often come at great costs. And for Abraham Lincoln, the cruelty of politics was about to sneak up on him.
John Wilkes Booth was a supporter of the South, and it's believed that he was supported by the Confederate Intelligence Service, but he wanted to be a hero. So while Abraham Lincoln is out at the theater with his wife to watch My American Cousin, John Wilkes Booth, with some conspirators, enters the theater from the rear entrance. He walks up to the booth that Lincoln is sitting in, and he pulls the trigger and shoots Lincoln in the back of the head.
But although Lincoln survived for just a few hours more, he was doomed, and that was the end of Lincoln.
Booth leaps onto the stage and breaks his leg in the process, and he screams out, "Death to dictators."
So the Battle of Gettysburg is really significant because up until that point, the Confederates actually had quite a few victories under their belt. They had a general who was capable of delivering that. After Gettysburg, there was no chance that that would happen again. The Confederates were on the back foot. They were losing battles. There was no capability of them ever winning. So if you see Gettysburg as the high water mark of the Confederacy, from that point onwards, the Confederacy was doomed. And that meant, of course, that we're looking at the abolition of slavery. We're looking at the change of approach to the United States, the fact that everybody was free, therefore creating the modern United States out of the ashes of this Civil War.
It would have still been possible to achieve some kind of negotiated peace. After that, the North is confident that the South will fall. That's no longer possible.
It is Gettysburg that led to the freedom of all in the United States today.
But the big way that Gettysburg has affected American history is that it was treated after the battle as a joint American tragedy. So it took a singular place in the American mind as a place that both the North and the South suffered terribly at. And it, in an ironic way, it becomes almost a unifying factor in that regard because of the shared trauma of the Battle of Gettysburg.
O Gettysburg, thy sacred ground, where history took its stand, in thee we find a future vast, a free united land. From carnage rose a beacon bright, of freedom's hallowed light. A union strong, a country healed, emerged from darkest night. 3 days of strife, of courage grand, did forge a nation's fate, where brothers clashed and heroes fell, and destiny did wait.